Um, Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrea Armeni. I am the Executive Director of Transform Finance, and I'm delighted to welcome you for today's webinar for our members and guests to cover the topic of affordable housing without government subsidies and the model that's been developed by New Way Homes that Sibley Simon will be presenting for us. If I can ask you once again to please mute yourselves on your end so we minimize the background noise, that would be greatly appreciated. Or I will try to mute you individually, but that might take a second. So before we get started with Morgan and Sibley, just a very quick update from the Transform Finance Investor Network. A couple of things I wanted to bring to our members' attention. Next week, we will be at the Skoll World Forum in Oxford, where I know quite a few of you will be. And we would be delighted if you could join us for an event that we're doing on Wednesday, April 5th. It's a side breakfast with our colleagues from Oxfam, where we'll be talking about the intersection of social justice and finance, unsurprisingly, and looking at a new report that Oxfam is putting out now on who is being left behind by impact investing and how to ensure that it reaches more communities. So if you will be at Skoll, please join us. We will also be at the Impact Capitalism Summit in Chicago in a few weeks, where we'll be on a panel with one of our investor network members, Beneficial State Bank, to discuss the role of alternative forms of banking and alternative banking structures, such as Beneficial State Bank and New Resource Bank, in contributing to community wealth creation. So please do join us if you're there. Lastly, for those of you that might remember, we mentioned recently to you a project that we are in the process of launching, doing a racial justice analysis of an investment portfolio across all asset classes. So if you're interested in the issue of how racial justice shows up in an investment portfolio, please do let us know. We would love to have you involved in that. And with that, I will turn it over to Morgan Simon, who is my co-founder and chair of the board at Transform Finance, as well as being managing director with Aner Ben-Ami of the Candide Group, to give us a little bit of an introduction to today's webinar presentation. And once again, if I may please ask all the, especially the call-in attendees, to mute yourselves. Thank you. Morgan, hold on, I can't hear you. All right. Morgan?
Hello. Yes.
There you
go. Okay. Shall I continue?
Please do. There is an echo again. I will ask people to mute themselves. Go ahead, Morgan.
Great. Let's see how this goes. So once again, my name is Morgan Simon. I know that some people may have known me as Pi Investments, and just to explain the name change there for Nair and myself, that as in the last year we've begun working with the Libra Foundation as well on their investment portfolio, that we've rebranded as Candide Group as the entity that's serving Pi Investments in Libra. So nothing substantive has changed, except that we now get to make more obscure Voltaire references and get to kind of expand the scope of what we do. So that's been very exciting. The other kind of name thing to call out here is that oftentimes when there's two people with the same last name on a slide, the point of me coming on is to say there's absolutely no relation. Grateful to you. So I am very blessed that Sibley, how many years ago, that Sibley and my sister connected and married, and Sibley very kindly took our family name. So anyone who'd like to be a Simon, know that it is available to you. And Sibley has been a long-time supporter of the social investment space, from the Responsible Endowments Coalition to very instrumental in the founding of Transform Finance, and in general has been very interested over the years in this role of how do you use capital to support changes in society. So I think one of the things we often find in impact investment, given that we are such a small field, is what Don Schaefer likes to refer to as the confluence of interests. That we're usually connected to people in a multitude of ways, and that hopefully that's something we get to use to our advantage. So who better to just to introduce Sibley in terms of having a really strong sense of his track record as an entrepreneur and then of what he's looking to do in the future. So basically, the broader context and why this is coming forward, oh, thank you for that lovely photo, why this is coming forward to the network today. One of the questions that we've gotten from a lot of Transform Finance Network members since November, I would say, is what is the role of private capital going to be in the Trump era? And that, in general, a question that we've been exploring as investors for quite some time is how do we really think about the appropriate role of government alongside impact investors? And sometimes it's concern, particularly in developing market context, of impact investment kind of replacing government services, right? When you have kind of essentially privatization of water, of energy, of different resources, if that provides immediate access for people, then maybe that's a positive thing in a space that only private markets are going to fulfill effectively. But does that create kind of this long-term expectation that you have private entities that are providing these services as opposed to the government? And we're entering kind of an even more acute phase of having to address that problem head-on, where you have a government that is not only sort of unwilling to take care of some basic needs for citizens, but actively hostile, right, and cutting budgets of essential services, which I think has created this urgency for impact investors to say, how do we really step up our game and think beyond even the idea of privatization into community action, and the way that community ownership and leadership can mean something very different than just the typical way that we view privatization, and the way that privatization can sometimes be a dirty word. One of the areas where I think this dynamic is particularly interesting is in the context of housing. So as investors, we have done a couple of years of kind of overviews within our real assets work of thinking about what do we do about housing, right? And that a lot of what is investable on the market is what's called quote unquote workforce housing, which is typically looking at the types of incomes that like a teacher or a fireman is going to have, or firewoman. And I think that Sibley is going to get into some of those distinctions, right, between working class and workforce, and that workforce housing typically is a lot more middle income. And that what we kept hearing over and over again was that it was very difficult, almost impossible, to invest in affordable housing that didn't have some level of government subsidization as part of that process. And that kind of keeps us increasingly dependent on the idea of having a supportive government to ensure that low-income housing is going to be a feature of a community. And I think that the other kind of ethical consideration in that is that it assumes that affordable housing is something that basically is for the people who have failed, or for the people who are never going to have access to the basic economic resources of society, right? That affordable housing is something that is subsidized when you do not have the ability to support yourself, as opposed to the idea that housing should just be an affordable resource that is available to everyone, that doesn't imply that you failed and had to go after the subsidy in order to get it. And Sibley had been working for the past five years to a decade. He can certainly give more of his context in having supported a number of initiatives around the mounting homelessness challenge in Santa Cruz and Monterey County, and really looking at these elements of having a massive housing shortage and a large homeless population, many of whom could benefit from a housing first approach, but not having access to those resources, and largely due to the limits of government subsidy. So started to really do some thinking about what could a model mean that would make affordable housing just another segment of the market, as opposed to the idea that it's part of the market that's going to consistently require subsidizing, that's going to consistently kind of carry the stigma of being for the people who are locked out of the economy as a whole. So that requires a lot of complex structuring and diving into some of these markets that are really quite challenging. So I'm really looking forward to today getting to learn a lot more about how those pieces are structured and kind of how you make it work. And I know that that's what Sibley has been really laser focused on in developing his project. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Morgan. Let me just unmute Sibley on his end and turning to the presenter. There we go.
Great. Can you hear me?
Can hear you very well. Thank you so much for joining us, Sibley. I really look forward to this.
Thank you. Thanks, Morgan, for that introduction. I'm going to dive right in here. This chart is inflation-adjusted rent over 40 years, but everywhere in the United States has a chart like this, and the national chart doesn't look that different from this. So while a lot of the details of a solution have to be couched in terms of a state or a local region, because you get into the weeds on everything from zoning and other regulations and what programs are available, et cetera. I want to stress that, overall in the United States, in most areas, I think a lot of people on this call probably know, housing is becoming less affordable to the majority of people who don't already own their home.
And for those of us that are joining us on the phone, we'll be able, if Sibley agrees, to share the slides after the presentation. But for now, we can just give you a very quick overview of what the slide presents. This looks at the reality of the Monterey Bay region, where Sibley is working with New Way Homes. And it shows the increase from the 1970s to 2010 of in the affordability gap, and how the difference has increased between the wage for high school teachers, firefighters, dental assistants, and other categories, and how it has not kept pace with the increase in market rent.
Great, thanks, Andrea, and I'll try to make my comments reflect what we're seeing as well. So and this is just one view at it. I'm going to quickly go past a couple of things. Obviously, this problem can be dissected in many ways and has been. And again, I think a lot of people on the call are going to be familiar with a lot of these things. So I'm just going to go quickly and say, here, this is a couple charts from our Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, a great organization trying to promote regional solutions to major things that affect economic development, but also just social well-being in our region. And so again, here's a chart that one can make from a lot of places. But what this shows is, United States, more and more people, in just a 5-year period here, are impacted by unaffordable housing rates. And again, it's true in a lot of areas, but this kind of shows that if there is a road to unaffordability, California is right at the forefront of walking down that road, unfortunately. And this little region that I'm working with to try to demonstrate a solution that can be brought to other places as well is also ahead on that unfortunate path. So we see, even bigger, and it's not just that things are less affordable here, it's that it's accelerating at an even worse rate. So the unaffordability is growing rapidly. Here's Santa Cruz County, Santa Cruz City, that's the north half of our region. Very similar chart for the Monterey County as well.
And here we're looking at unaffordability as being over 30% of disposable income spent on housing, correct?
That's correct. So that's just one measure. We look at over 50% of household income, or we slice that by just low-income households, and the numbers look even worse, of course. Similarly, really looking at the growth in median rent compared with the growth in median income. So this really, cuts to the chase of it. Most lower income households are renting, and here when their income is not going up rapidly and rent is going up rapidly, it's obvious what the problem is. That's happening again across the United States. Even greater difference in those rates of growth in California and in our local area here. So I see it again, not saying that, oh, this area is so much worse than everywhere else, but unfortunately the overall trend is in the wrong direction nationally, and this is an area that already looks like other areas will look in just a few years. So I want to prove that we can solve this here and demonstrate that for a lot of places. I'm sure it's also immediately apparent to many people on the call what a lot of the negative effects are of this unaffordability. So this is a whole presentation as well that you could dive into, but just very rapidly, as Morgan mentioned, about 5 years ago, I co-founded an effort here to solve veteran and chronic homelessness in Santa Cruz County. We've housed in a jurisdiction of under 300,000 people. We've housed nearly 600 individuals who fit into those categories of homelessness, and we have a goal to end those categories of homelessness by 2020. But like many other of the challenges we face as communities face across the nation, the low availability of housing, not only the high price, but just the extreme lack of availability really hampers that effort. And that's how I got into working on how can we build some more housing for a housing first model around homelessness, but then seeing the rapid deterioration of affordability for a much wider set of people, also causing individuals to fall into homelessness or households to do so in some cases, but then looking at the many other negative effects, environmental effects and the social effects, and just all the effects that come from displacing a large number of people out of their community. Extreme housing unaffordability that comes on rapidly is one of the worst challenges that community can face, and unfortunately, a lot of places are facing that. So we get in, why is this the case? So there's a first order cause, which is really just an extreme lack of supply. So recent study here looking at California as a whole state, California would need 3.5 million more homes than it currently has just to have the average number of homes per capita that the United States has, or the states across the nation have. So there again, we're seeing that affordability is worsening across the nation, so that's not even a great bar to achieve, but nevertheless, California is that far behind. Furthermore, the other part of that dynamic is that each year there's increased demand. We're not growing rapidly by historical standards, but if California grows 1% a year, there's increased demand for housing each year. And yet, what do we create? We don't even keep up with that increase in demand. We build relative to this whole picture, a very tiny amount of government-subsidized affordable housing, few thousand units a year. When you're looking at such a big deficit, those are very important units to build, and we need to do more of it, but it's not addressing the scale of the problem. Similarly, the market rate, and I don't love categorizing everything, as you'll see why as I go through this presentation. I don't love categorizing everything that is in government-subsidized affordable housing as market rate housing, but nevertheless, predominantly that's all been high-end housing, majority of it for sale in most places. And so we're building around 100,000 units of housing a year in California. It's ticked up a little bit recently, but not even keeping up with overall increase in demand. So not a big surprise. Supply is that constraint, you get very high prices. But then, that's not that satisfying an answer, of course, because if there are such high prices and therefore high income that could come with housing, why is the market, even just open market forces, why are they not creating more housing? And this also is an entire presentation, has been studied at length by many parties. The Bay Area Council Economic Institute's done some great studying, lots of others across California and nationally. But a few of the highlights you can look at, you can say there's a lot of barriers to producing more housing. some of these highlights. I'll just throw out a couple examples, and especially examples that are barriers to creating the kind of housing we most need. So less expensive units, just to put a label on it. So affordability always comes to the question, affordable to whom? You know, you need less expensive units in broad strokes. So down in the weeds, and every local jurisdiction and every state has these barriers. So impact fees, I'm working with some local jurisdictions here to take a look at, you know, when you have a $10,000 a unit water hookup fee, well, it's fine that, or arguably, you know, we need to somehow get funding for our water infrastructure. We've made that policy decision that we put that on new development. But when that impact fee is structured on a per unit basis, then that essentially becomes a higher tax on creating smaller, less expensive units than it is on larger luxury units, for example. So it's just one detailed example where often little things in the policy bias the system against, even more than just the profit motive, bias the system against creating less expensive units. So these are things we can work on. We can work on these policies. I'm involved a little bit at the state level through California Forward, and more so locally on how do we make policy changes to reduce some of these barriers. But as a social entrepreneur, I'm even more interested in, okay, those slow policy changes, now that this is such a challenge that's so visible, will get worked on and are being worked on. We have to have a voice to make them worked on in the right way. But in the meantime, and not knowing how far that work's going to get, what are solutions that we can implement today? So given today's policies, how can we create less expensive housing for more people? One answer, of course, is more government subsidy. As Morgan mentioned, you know, from a federal perspective, it's a very challenging time for this. But California is looking at a lot of ways to do this. New bonds, some new taxes that have a solid chance of getting passed, and local governments are looking at that too. So again, I get involved a little bit in that. I'm extremely supportive of a lot of the efforts to do that. I hope we do. But it's also important to have a realistic view that if we pass a lot of what's being considered and has a solid chance in California today, we might triple our rate at creating affordable housing. That's fantastic, but again, it goes from one drop in the bucket to 3 drops in the bucket, and we've got a very big bucket. So we also need more solutions. Good, but not sufficient here. So now we're getting to what fits the title of this talk. How can we have new plans to create high social impact housing, less expensive, more affordable to more people, housing without the competitive government subsidies? Now, I put the adjective competitive in there because sometimes there are government subsidy programs that are underused. And so we do need to put those to use to achieve an even higher social impact than we could otherwise. So there's a little asterisk there on without government subsidy. But we all know the tax credit programs, all the bond financing are extremely competitive. There are great organizations that specialize in creating 100% low income, very low income, affordable housing using those programs. One of my ethical stances is I don't want to compete for those sources of funding because that's not increasing the pie. We need those organizations creating that great housing to use those, and we need to push for more such funding, but not just shuffle around that limited pie.
Can you help us simply understand a little bit better the difference between the competitive and the non-competitive government subsidies for those of us that are less familiar with it?
Yeah, so, you know, just as one example, the tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, program that is continuing to have some real bipartisan support in Congress, for example. There are challenges today because tax credits are a little less valuable right now as there's uncertainty to what's the corporate tax rate going to be a year from now. So, you know, that's that program. But it takes, often takes a project, has to score perfectly on a whole long list of criteria, and then may have to compete for 3 years to get that tax credit allocation. So there's a lot of effort to bring great affordable housing projects to bear that meet a lot of requirements and preferences, and then they really have to compete to that pie. There's only so many, especially the 9% tax credits. That's an example of that. Now, an example on the other side, sometimes, like even in some localities, we mentioned the tenant-based subsidies, Section 8, I'll mention later, or what we've done here locally, one that is near and dear to my heart, is that we have created a pathway for people who are chronically homeless, who traditionally are underserved in getting those vouchers. They don't have a mailing address consistently for years to stay on waiting lists, et cetera, to get those tenant-based vouchers. So we've increased some of the social impact of those tenant-based vouchers, like a Section 8 voucher. So we have those, but then people lose them because they have 3 months or with some extensions a little bit longer to find housing that will accept it. They don't quite pay market rate in many markets because of the way, the formula for how the rent is calculated. And so often there's an underutilized subsidy. It's a tenant-based subsidy. Occasionally there are some that can go into projects in other ways. So we're another example, working with cities that own land that's underused but could be a great fit for housing projects. So you know, we're favorable about, oh, the cities could put land into a deal, for example. So those are examples where sometimes we find little corners where there's subsidy that's underused. We want to maximize impact by putting it to good use.
Great, thank you. So putting it, yeah, in other words, or at least how I'm looking at it, part of the additionality of the impact that you're having is that you're not crowding out somebody else who would be using that credit, but you are actually building extra units that are not relying on the same pie, right?
Absolutely, and we want every resource to maximize the impact that it can have. And when I say maximize impact, often that means reach as far down as possible in the income scale to achieve affordability. So I'd hate to see, you know, only half as many units built on a land compared to what is zoned and could easily be permitted, for example. That's a density. It's another resource you want to see maximized when it's so hard to get. But another one is, yeah, these subsidies where they can go to great projects that can maximize and want to do that. So, an overall goal is looking back at that initial chart where rent adjusted for inflation is going up so rapidly. We want to stop that. So let's just create enough, and this is rental housing. Beyond the scope of this presentation is home ownership. I may mention it a couple of ways. Those markets are influence each other, and we care about that as well. But primary consideration here is looking at rental market. How do we stop this rise in median rent, you know, period? So finding how can we create enough supply that alone causes median rent to go up. It is, I mean, to not go up. It is possible. In fact, here even at least in a real short-term time frame, it seems like even the extreme markets of San Francisco and San Jose, median rent might be coming down a tiny bit off of its peak because so many projects are coming out. But beyond that, getting the supply, starting to really build supply at the scale that we need, and the right kind of supply in the right case, in the right places with transit, jobs, all those things. We want, with our effort, we want to have this, while we're doing that, have the supply we're creating that affects the overall market not be build to the high end where profit is maximized, but we want to build to the middle, lower end of the income scale so that impact is maximized while we're on that path. So that's our two twin goals. Stop rising rent with higher supply, but do that by building the supply that's really not happening today at nearly the scale we need. So I have a primary way we're working to do that, but I wanted to highlight another solution that I've recently been running into and starting to work with a little bit, and that's accessory dwelling units. So these are the units people put in their backyard, colloquially, second unit on a single family home property. So some jurisdictions across the nation have had good ADU ordinances for decades. Santa Cruz is one of those. Portland famously is one of those. And California just passed last year a law that means that every jurisdiction in California has to have a policy that's at least in certain ways friendly toward the creation of ADUs. So it's kind of like how the Affordable Care Act says that all healthcare policies have to at least cover certain things, have to be of certain minimum quality, and has some details as to what that means. California just did the same thing for accessory dwelling units. So if you're building over a garage, or if you have these setbacks, or if you, parking, how much parking, it says local jurisdictions, you have to come up with your own policy, but it has to meet these minimums. And that is fantastic. The McKinsey analysis that said we're 3.5 million units short of average across the United States said that perhaps ADUs could make up 800,000 units of that across California. Well, that sounds great, but the track record of actually doing this is terrible. So most places that have had friendly ADU ordinances for decades, very, very few are created. You know, Santa Cruz had one for over 30 years. In the first 20 years, created maybe 10 ADUs a year. Now it might be ticking up to close to 20, but it's really not that many. And then there's a whole black market of people, you know, illegally, gray market, I should say, I guess, illegally converting their garages, et cetera. It's not great in a lot of ways either. So Portland's an exception. They really accelerated their ADU production, and some great learnings from that. But the big barriers, you know, first, okay, great, we got the state policy is done. You know, we're getting these good local policies. The big barriers are, you know, it's very unrealistic to ask many homeowners to become a developer, to learn how to do a good job managing 6 different contractors that it takes to permit, design, permit, and then construct and finance an ADU. So there's some interesting efforts on that. There's a company in Los Angeles called Building Blocks that's trying to address exactly that. They have a handful of ADUs that they're building now, including a higher profile pilot with the mayor's office in Los Angeles. And so looking at how to make that turnkey. And we've got great ideas that they're implementing. And one of the sides is financing. So I think it might be the first, or certainly one of the first ADUs to be get its own financing loans, not a home equity line of credit. That's a high bar for some folks to achieve, and it's not necessarily the underlying mortgage on the house. It's a secondary one that looks at, okay, the income, the increase in property value, the increase in income that's going to come from this ADU and can finance it. Because one of the things we have to do is to teach lenders how to look at this product and how to finance it. So when I say we, it's 2 organizations that do a part of our model. I'll be talking about that in a minute, but Envision Housing is a mission-driven housing residential developer that I'm a partner of. And we're looking at a collaboration or partnership with Building Blocks to say, how can we turn this work? How can we help them take it to a next stage? And, you know, as they put it, make multifamily development include scattered site multifamily. So how can we take a jurisdiction like Watsonville, California here in our area, find 10 homeowners, a cohort, eventually could be a larger number, to all go through together and say, okay, we're going to turnkey this. Some of our cash flow financing for permitting might be a unified vehicle. And how do we create 10 ADUs all at the same time through the local jurisdiction? So it is an interesting thing. That's interesting process that we're just noodling on, coming up with the model and going to be trying to do. So I mentioned that as one whole direction. So with that, Andrea, I don't know if there's any questions that you have or people have on, you know, the overall situation, the problem, as I've painted it, you know, the ADU idea, and then if not, I'm going to go next into the New Way Homes primary model.
Great, thank you. I encourage the attendees, either to speak up if you're not muted, or unmute yourself, or you can use the chat function if you are joining us through the platform. And I heard somebody speaking up. Go right ahead.
This is Morgan. I hope this doesn't come off as too off topic, but I think for those of us who are in the Bay Area, it's kind of heavy on our hearts right now. I don't know if you read about the fire, I guess 2 days ago in West Oakland, which was 86 units of transitional housing. And apparently that had been under pretty severe neglect for quite some time as the landlord was trying to get the nonprofit service provider to move out. And there's now speculation and investigation around arson, and sort of an interesting case of, sort of a landlord or owner, I guess developer, who, had what was created as affordable housing, fighting vehemently to get rid of it. And it's interesting as you're talking about kind of converting people to start to think about, being in a position of being able to develop affordable housing. I'm curious if, it's just that we have, on one hand, a moral crisis that's being addressed in other ways, and that you just work with the people who want to do good, or, I guess it kind of connects back to then how you think about the economic incentives in your work, and to what degree does someone have to be a bit of a bleeding heart to want to do this kind of development, versus in some ways you're kind of showing like, no, you can actually do this in a way that provides you with a reasonable return, so that you aren't trying to burn down your building to get the low-income tenants out.
Yeah, I can't comment on that. Just such recent news that's devastating, but it highlights several things. One of those is we are losing affordable housing. So I put on, that earlier chart, the amount of affordable housing, new affordable housing that we're building. We also have some that we're losing by timing out, and that's a big issue, and hopefully some of the new mechanisms of funding will help to have us go, and it's a big issue across the United States, affordable housing that was originally built with a 40-year time frame or 55-year time frame is timing out, and we need to preserve it. Also the issue that a lot of our housing stock is very old and in many cases poorly kept up. One of the huge problems with the housing market and rental market that we have is there's not much incentive for landlords to keep up the quality of the housing. Anything you have will get rented, and will get rented at a fairly high price. One of the things, well understood dynamics is when you have a very low vacancy market, the range in prices gets compressed, and a lot of that's the bottom coming up. So there's less difference between the larger and smaller units, the higher quality, lower quality, location, et cetera, less difference than there otherwise would be, because availability is so low, you get so many auctions. So it demonstrates that. And then to your core question, I think I'll address it as I go along. But we're trying to construct models where most of the actors in that model don't have to understand all of what we're doing, don't have to understand all the other pieces, don't have to think out of the box. And that's just practical, because we want to swim downstream in as many ways as we can, and we want to create this at scale. So you can go way outside the box with a model and spend 5 years, 10 years building one building. If we're going to bend the supply curve that affects overall prices, and a lot of this desperate need for so much affordable housing is because obviously the prices are so high. So if we shrink that, that will help in addition to creating more affordable housing. So in trying to accomplish those things, we have to go at scale. And it means for local jurisdictions who have a lot of different constituencies and different mindsets that change and vary. For some parts of the capital stack, for builders, et cetera, we need to just we're building housing, not out of the box here. Then there's other ways where we are putting new pieces of the model together so that we have high impact. So I'll get to some of those details. Shall I go ahead, Andrea?
One quick thing, I don't mean to get you too far off
Sure.
from your core presentation here, but two questions that came in for you, Sibley. One is around what factors differentiated Santa Cruz from doing ADU versus the experience in Portland under similar regulations, I believe. And the second question is on whether you have any comments or you have looked at the model of repurposing shipping containers for this type of ADU housing or affordable housing in general.
So one quick thing, Portland itself had very slow ADU completion, and one of the things they did was just, relax some of the zoning rules in ways that are happening in California now, that just increases eligibility. So properties don't get thrown out by just, where the setbacks are or exact size or different other things. So more properties are eligible. But the other thing they really did was change the fees and reduce fees. And, when you don't have a $30,000 fee that's just on top of cost of construction to just create it, that can make a huge difference. So, that's one of the things they did that really increased production. And I think they've done some other things as well. So what Portland really did is look at the mindset of, okay, from the point of view of a local jurisdiction, what are the things we can do to really accelerate this? How can we reduce some barriers? And they did succeed, have been succeeding at getting in the last few years much higher production of ADUs. We feel, we need to go even further because it's still such a daunting challenge for most homeowners to try to navigate this themselves, and there's not a market of service providers to really make it more turnkey. So we think yes and, California has just made a bunch of those policy changes. Local jurisdictions still have, very high fees in many cases, but even with that, if we make it turnkey, a lot of the financing can help homeowners get over that initial upfront fee hurdle. So.
Thank you.
So our primary model here is about multifamily, single site development, essentially apartment buildings. And really, there's no one silver bullet here, but it's saying, how can we, it's a complex process. How can we develop a toolkit, a whole set of tools, each of which lowers the cost in some way, directly or indirectly, of ongoing costs, upfront costs, etc., and or otherwise increases the opportunity of how much housing we build or how many people we can serve in that housing, etc. So changes the cost equation. Each of these tools can change the cost equation, and then how do we find sites and look at them through that lens? Find a site and say, okay, here's a usually infill development site, so usually job, service, and transit rich, and say, how can we maximize the impact with a whole suite of tools? What applies to this particular potential project? And can we then get it above the bar that we set on the impact we want to achieve with every project? So to get more specific, it's really a long list. There we go. Of tools. These are just some of them and some of the highlights here. So and I'm not going to go in any great detail with most of these, but there are policies that are underused. So outside of 100% affordable housing, not that many housing projects use the state bonus density that we happen to have, where if you set aside 20% of your units as deed restricted, income limited, affordable housing at certain income levels, then you can get 35% more units in your approval than the local jurisdiction would otherwise allow you in its planning density. So that's just one example. TODs, transit-oriented development, really important one. Also, if you do a certain amount of affordable housing in California now, relatively recently, and you're in a sufficiently transit-rich environment, then the local jurisdiction can't require you to have more than a certain amount of parking. So I don't want to get into the weeds of those, but it shows that, like, oh, there were policies put in place to incentivize this kind of less expensive housing development and the increase of more low-income affordable housing or very low-income affordable housing, and yet some of these tools are underused. So how can we employ those? How can we develop the right product, a very good quality product with amenities that are very appreciated but not a luxury product? How do we get sustainable operations? Because in our model, where we're continuing to operate these buildings in the very long term permanently, the lower operating costs, such as energy expenses, if it takes 15 years to pay back something we're doing for energy efficiency, that still reduces increases the amount of debt we can cover, and therefore improves the funding. Modular construction, et cetera. So I mentioned creative land deals with nonprofits or cities in a lot of cases, a lot of things, but the bottom three things are because this is a finance-oriented group that I'm going to talk more about today. So 7, 8, and 9 here, where first of all, price, once we get going on designing a product, we actually don't care what the market rate rent is. We want to say, how do we, we're going to set our rents to, in a complex way, but set our total rent from a building to cost. So we can say, okay, we need to pay the debt we need to take on to build this building. We need to cover that with a debt coverage ratio. That's what we need to achieve. And the more that's under the market, the better. And not having owners that have tension on that issue is absolutely critical. So not having building owners that are trying to maximize profits and are trying to extract out of operating profit is very important. So I'm going to go a little bit more into some of those things, but to zoom back a little bit so you understand what we're talking about is we have two entities. On the right on this slide is Envision Housing, which is a mission-driven business. It's a development company. So we're doing the development effort to find projects, apply for them to local jurisdictions, set up the project, seek financing, all these things. Then New Way Homes we wanted to have as a nonprofit. So New Way Homes is a nonprofit with 501c3 status is pending. That is really a finance fund and vehicle to replace that equity financing that would normally be investors trying to get a very high rate of return in a real estate development project. So we want to replace that with a new structure. So New Way Homes is assembling impact capital to play that role. We're going to get into the details of that a little bit more. So, but I want to paint a little picture because it gets very abstract. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that financing. But to paint a little picture, here's a potential first project, just my little schematic, not an architectural diagram, obviously. But here's a site that is what we call here a homeless services center. So a number of these buildings you see are providing different types of services. On the upper right, there's a big 3-story building. It's a family, most of the buildings, a family shelter for families coming out of homelessness that provides supportive services to help them get into permanent housing. There's also a health clinic there. So here's a site with concentrated set of services from case management to health care, a recuperative care center where homeless individuals can come after a hospital inpatient visit, and a lot of tools to bring around helping people into housing. And what we're looking to finance through New Way Homes in partnership with the Homeless Services Center is a new building that's, in this case, all permanent supportive housing. So it has some program space for some of the nonprofits that operate there, but also up to about 100 units of permanent supportive housing. So in general, the right answer that we pursue is scattered site housing for most individuals coming out of homelessness, support them and becoming members out in the community in their path to their own, whatever level of self-sufficiency they can attain. But here, there's some folks in the chronic homeless population that really, for a period of time or indefinitely or permanently, need more services on a more frequent basis in order to then be able to live stably and be stably housed and successful in their housing. So we need one site like this in Santa Cruz. We need some in other jurisdictions around the region. So we're looking at this model where not taking any substantial grant funding from governments in order to build this building, because we're able to get the tenant-based subsidy that I talked about earlier. So this is a specialized project, but it shows how, okay, we find an opportunity and a need, bring some of our tools to bear, others are not relevant in this case, and find a financial picture that works for this building. I'll tell you a little bit about more of what the rest of our projects will typically look like. So any real estate development project has a capital stack. The capital stacks for affordable housing projects traditionally are extremely complicated. Might have half dozen or more different sources, including the tax credits. Ours is a little bit simpler in some ways, saying that some of the legend is missing on this slide, but the point is that 70–80% of the funding is going to come from pretty traditional, this is for construction funding, again, just construction funding, from traditional lenders, local banks who will think a little bit outside the box with us, or nonprofit, CDFIs. who are excited about this model. So we have a number of folks who have expressed strong interest in lending on these buildings. And then the smaller slices in that capital stack I showed here, potentially 15% coming from the New Way Homes Fund, and a few more percent in some cases will be from impact investors who want to invest in one specific building as opposed to through the fund. So those are example sources. And in some cases, the land is separately funded by an organization who wants to put the land into being a part owner of the whole project.
And Sibley, on that 80%, and I think actually the rest of the legend, yeah, is on that slide.
There we go.
On that 80%, is it something that qualifies for Community Reinvestment Act credits, and is that something that more traditional banks do under the CRA?
In some cases, you know, some of those credits, like the new market tax credits, are more commercial. But yeah, we've been looking at that, and it's, you know, some of those I'm a little cautious of because, again, you know, if they're being used successfully, that's great already. Others, you know, rightly so, a lot of those tools have been used to work together. So some tools have been specifically built to be the gap financing in tax credit funded projects. And so the rules by which they operate are meant to all be together, and you can't really take one of those pieces out and use it in something that's structured quite a bit differently. So there's a lot of technical details in what fits and what doesn't. But we are exploring some of those, yeah. And anywhere where, again, whether it's an underutilized tool that can help us increase the impact of a project we want to do. So there's the construction capital stack, but then there's the permanent financing capital stack. And this is one of the examples where, as I was saying earlier, we want to just build a model that can swim downstream. And so here we're saying, okay, permanent financing, we just want to be eligible for the typical market rate financing, that's apartment building financing. Once you have a building built and occupied and you show your rent level and your expenses level, then you can really just finance it, and you are up against two limits. One's the value, appraised value, say, of the property. And here in our model, you know, a silver lining of the housing market we're in is that when we build this housing, we're seeing we can often get a value that allows, with a loan-to-value ratio, allows us to have permanent financing that covers all of the construction financing. So it covers not only the debt we need to pay back, construction funding debt to banks or CDFIs, but also can take back out the New Way Homes Impact Investment Fund part of the deal, so that money can go to seed a new project. So New Way Homes cycles its money, sees itself primarily as a construction lender or preferred equity holder that's going to get bought out from permanent financing. And so when I show on this slide, oh, unrealized value, well, that's because the appraised value, when a lender, a permanent financing lender, can look at this when they're just thinking about, you know, potential value of a property, can pretend, oh, this is just a market rate apartment building that has 15 or 20% of the units deed restricted to low income. That's customary, inclusionary housing. You know, playing by those rules, that's great. So they just think of it, okay, here's housing, we know how to rent a housing. So you're, you know, with your more complex formula of who you're renting to at what rent levels, that's fine as long as you can pay the debt and cover the debt coverage ratio. So that's the other constraint. One is the appraised value of the property, which tends to be very high. We're not realizing all that value because we're not charging market rate rent. So the other level, the critical level that then we have to meet and that we don't particularly want to exceed is the debt coverage ratio. So we have to have enough net income from the rent after operating expenses to make the debt payments and have the required margin above that. So then we see a third stack then, which is I'm calling our rent level stack. So this is where we try to, where we have to meet that bar of paying off the debt that we have to achieve, and we've done lots of things to try to lower the amount of debt we need to take on. But then when we have that permanent debt financing, say, okay, we have to achieve a certain bar relative to that. What's the most impact we can have in this project? So we see this other stack of saying, okay, there may be some permanent supportive housing in here. which might be the rent for which is financed in one of a couple different ways, few ways. There might, for people coming out of chronic homelessness, there might be there almost surely will be some deed-restricted additional low or very low-income housing that's not focused on that, paired with those supportive services, but is more affordable housing in a traditional sense, inclusionary housing. Then a bulk of the units in many cases might be this, where we're trying to peg rent at the housing authority payment standard rate. That's one marker we see. There's other things we can do, but that's one marker that's a goal, because then we can both take anyone else who has a subsidy voucher at that for those units, because one of the things, again, not happening is sufficient utilization of those tenant-based vouchers. So we can meet that need and reach down to lower income folks who are lucky enough to have those vouchers, and then also just rent to other people at that level, where it is that workforce housing, as Morgan mentioned, the middle income who can pay the rent for that housing, but still can't find things 15, 30% or more above that rent level that's the open market median rate. And, you know, people are squeezed not just by that rent level, but by the availability. So people on the lower income of who can afford that rent level even, you know, are not able to find things that are available to them in many cases and get sent out of the market for that reason. So we can start filling that gap with a bulk of the units. And then I put in this stack, we try not to have housing that we have to say is market rate. But in a lot of ways, that's our cushion that says, okay, if the only way we can get the finances of a project to work out is to have 10% of the units be just truly market rate, median rate units. Now, again, we're making a product. It's not the luxury product. But nevertheless, whatever market rate is for those units, we can do that. And we're willing to do that if we need to. It's not a preference, but again, to hit that bar.
And I'd like to emphasize there the analogy, which I think is very apt, that some of the listeners or members might have seen on prior calls. It's the idea of the approach to the impact as being either, well, in this case, maximizing the impact under the constraint of whatever returns you have set out, and we've covered this in part even with that 100% approach across an entire portfolio. You might want to look in each asset class at just how much impact can you get, given that you have some return constraints there. And I think this is a very good application of that model to this rent level stack. They say, if I need to put in a little bit of this, like in this case, the 10% market rate housing to make it work, great. Otherwise, let's see within the constraints of what I need to make it work, just how much of that impact can I have.
Exactly. And here, you know, we feel like, okay, even the market rate housing, again, for the type of product that we're actually building, has positive impact, because we need to have extended impact by just meeting the supply need. And thereby affecting the market for everyone outside of the buildings that we're creating. So a real key part of this is by having these rent reductions, and there's more than just self-imposed. We do have some structure around this and some obligations we can set up with investors and the fund. But the point is, it's not a deed restriction, so that it doesn't scare off the banks and those lenders that want their fixed return, but with the security that if disaster struck, they could treat it like a market rate building with some deed restricted affordable housing. So that's what I mean by self-imposing rent reductions on a majority of the units. It's management imposed. And then optimizing the rent stack for just enough income to fit the financial model. And then because of that, we've also already been seeing that even some of those pretty traditional lenders have been willing to look at lower debt coverage ratio, because they already know how to do that. Affordable housing, nonprofit housing that gets the other subsidies does get a debt coverage ratio if it's borrowing a small slice of its capital stack. So there's a product out there for that. And there's been some interest in applying that product because really on the argument that, look, there's less risk here on these rents, because If you're charging less than the market rate rent, economy goes up and down, the overall supply goes up and down, you're still going to have plenty of demand at a below rent level. Right now, we're seeing maybe San Francisco's median rent is going down 5%, so pulling back, 9 months of rent increase, which is exciting as a trend, even if it's so extremely unaffordable. Because of supply, that's great, but if we're, in that kind of a market, 30% below market rate, it just doesn't affect the finances. So lenders can see, okay, there's an argument there that you could have a somewhat lower debt coverage ratio, which really helps create more affordable housing units, more workforce housing units in a project. So again, there's so many details to so many of these tools, but I want to move on to what really is New Way Homes. What are we actually doing here on this capital that's replacing the traditional real estate market rate equity investment that's very high return seeking. So New Way Homes, again, is a nonprofit. It has a primary offering. It's a 506c offering for accredited investors. We really just raised the first small chunk of this last year to start paying pre-development costs to bring a pipeline of projects underway. So I mentioned that one that's near and dear to my heart because it's permanent supportive housing, but we have other projects that are more of this rent stack where workforce housing, deed-restricted affordable housing, et cetera, a stack of those projects. We're looking to bring a pipeline of those projects into a funnel so that we can be executing them, and as we prove this financial model, execute more and more of them at a time. So this one fund from New Way Homes, we have a target rate of 6% average annual return over 10 years. Now, a lot of that happens. There's a minimum interest payment that happens every year, 2.5%. It happens every year, and some variable interest rate. You saw this on, if any of you were on the webinar with the lift economy that Transform Finance did, fund a very similar structure where 95% of the returns from the loans that this fund makes gets distributed out to investors in a given year. But then what we do is, these buildings have that unrealized value that's just the book value in the asset. So something that we can do is, as the debt gets paid down year over year, as is required from the net income of those buildings, then we have more and more asset value there that we don't want to put to use. So obviously, we don't want to, in a lot of ways, put to use because we want to keep rents low. So we can, at the end of 10 years, we can use those assets to back this 6% target return. So we can refinance a building, for example, if we need to pull a little bit of equity out to bring investors up to the 6% average annual return. So that's a quick view of how that works, but that's how we feel pretty confident we can have a good model for achieving that return, but the return's capped. Technically, we have a 9% return cap, but really there's not going to be a path to get more than that target 6% return. So we really feel that's what we're seeking to meet. But then New Way Homes is assembling other capital as well. So that's that primary 506c offering. But meanwhile, New Way Homes received last year a $500,000 grant to be additional capital for loans that helps reduce that risk across other investors. So that's a key for a loan fund, obviously, to have that first at risk capital. Then we're in discussions with several foundations looking at making, not wanting to participate in that offering because having their own impact investment program and wanting to fit within that program. So things like, a 7-year, 2.5% loan into New Way Homes for the money to get reused in parallel with that fund. So we can bring other sources of capital under similar terms, often lower return than the 6% is typical. We don't think we need to offer a higher percentage than that in general. Working with some local employers to create an offering around that because employers are more interested in availability than they are in discount or financial return. So that's something real interesting that we're working on. And then we're evaluating right now what's the right vehicle for the unaccredited investor participation. You know, as Morgan mentioned, and here we are at Transform Finance, you know, it's incredibly important to me to see this such a place-based challenge and solution where you're building buildings in a community. If there's a financial return going to folks, I will really want to see this open to everyone locally who can participate, who sees how difficult the housing market is, sees the people and other entities make money off of that. Here we are trying to have a community-based, mission-driven model. Want everyone to be able to participate in that. So we're evaluating what the best way for us to do that, likely over the next year, is. So just to continue on my last topic, again, as Morgan said, I've been following Transform Finance since day one and passionate about those values as well. And so wanted to just explicitly say, you know, how do we bring these in? And that's still a work in process. So right now, the engaging community, fortunately, you know, their development, real estate development has a process for that. It's often a contentious process, so it's often there for the, you know, unfortunate reasons. But we can use that same process, you know, but start it at an even earlier, go in with a proactive mindset of talking to the community about, you know, where and how and what housing gets created. It's already been going in a lot of communities who are addressing this, of course, the normal planning processes that happen in jurisdictions. But from the point of view of specific development, we can fully engage in that process. And there's great models with the developers who have done a good job on that. And of course, there's always some controversy in local dynamics as well. And there just is with any change. So trying to work with that. And then, you know, the other thing, as I mentioned, we soon want to implement the non-accredited investor participation model. There, some big open questions that if anybody on this call here is open to discussing this further with me, I would really, I'm out there trying to learn more about how do we answer these questions right now. And I know there's a few things that have gone on across the United States on these models. I'd really like to learn more. You know, what are best practices with tenant residents being involved in the governance and the impact maximization? You know, obviously, you know, condo buildings have condo associations that totally make those decisions. But how do we, as an apartment building, where we have constraints as whether it's some of these will be nonprofit owned, like the first project I put up, others will be business entities set up just to operate this and pay property taxes, etc. How do we set that up in the way residents have a voice, but also a sense of you know, that ownership in how things and how its impact is maximized, but just how also it impacts their life. And dovetailing with that, looking at models, and I've run into, again, just really only 2 examples nationally that are just coming about now on how to share long-term equity with tenants. So we've got this equity in these buildings, in some cases, like I said, some cases that's taken on as nonprofit ownership of the buildings. In other cases, the right model for the local jurisdictions and the lenders is a business that owns it. There's eventually net equity there. We can back investors to get to that target return. Can we also help long-term residents more literally have some ownership and have the benefits that come with pride of that ownership, but also build towards, hopefully in many of their cases, build towards savings, build towards actual home ownership with all the benefits that come along with that for those who it makes sense for. How do we help use the net equity in these buildings as a tool to achieve that? Those are some of my big open questions that fit into Transform Finance values. So that's really the end of my summary. I know there's tons of detail on many of those topics, so if we have time here for a few questions, I'd love to see what people are more interested in.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Sibley. This was extremely enlightening, and indeed there have been a bunch of questions and comments that have been coming in. I'll just toss them out at you, and you'll take them in whatever order you'd like. And then if there's a moment, I'd love to give a couple of reflections on my end as well on that intersection with the principles. But I want to first give a chance to to folks that would like to put something. So one interesting thing was highlighting that there is actually a value to having the mixed incomes present in a particular project, right, on the social side, from having that 10% market rate, so having more of a integrated mixed income kind of community as a concept. Couple of questions that came up. One is around the how, if you could explain a little bit more how you can ensure that the affordable housing piece stays in place without there being a deed restriction there. Can
I just jump on those two, and then I'll come for another question. So on the first one, absolutely, that it's more and more recognized that whether it's the neighborhood or whether it's the community that is a building, wider ranges of mixed income provides more opportunity for more folks and great outcomes for children, et cetera. HUD really is focused on high opportunity neighborhoods right now. So that's absolutely a goal here. And whether or not we have any truly units that we call market rate or not, we're going to have a pretty wide range of incomes in most of these projects. The permanent supportive housing building was an exception, but in general, that's right. We do want to seek that, and that's just what fits with this model. So, so I'd say yes. And whether, some of those are a lot of folks at or a bit above our median, which in this region is more like $70,000 a year for household income. So we have a relatively high median income. So reaching to that or a bit more is already a pretty wide income range. Or some even above that is going to vary by project. So that's that question. On the how do we ensure the impact long term? So one is we do have deed restrictions in some of the units. I want to be totally clear. And in fact, New Way Homes loan policies, which I'd be happy to share with anybody who wants to write to me to see, require that a minimum of at least 15%, but often it'll be higher, of the units in the building be deed restricted as low or very low income. There's a whole formula, et cetera, on different income levels to as a long-term, if not permanent, affordable housing. So, and in order to have lower administrative burden on New Way Homes, it wants to see that happen by having the projects approved under inclusionary housing ordinances by local jurisdiction, California state bonus density, that also apply those deed restriction requirements and monitor them under existing systems. So we don't have to keep that monitoring under New Way Homes, but we know that it will be fulfilled because the projects have signed up for that requirement under state or local jurisdictions. So we want to do that. Then the question becomes, well, how do you maximize impact on the rest of the units? And we can't deed restrict so much without scaring off lenders, but what we can have is obligations that come under the loans from New Way Homes, even if those loans are primarily construction. Ideally all, or in some cases most of the funding is taken back out to New Way Homes upon permanent financing. Some of it, in some cases, might take a little bit longer to bring back to New Way Homes. But some obligations will persist. Impact reporting obligations, because we want to be able to analyze this and show the long-term impact and the income ranges that are living in these buildings, and report that to investors even after those loans are taken out. I mentioned the requirement to use some net equity to back the investor's target return. So that obligation will stay to a certain specified date in the future, such as, for a given New Way Homes fund, that 10-year point. So that obligation stays, and obligations about making decisions about rent, et cetera, can stay as well. And we're looking at the details on how to make those have some teeth, carrots and sticks. One carrot is, New Way Homes is not going to lend to a owner or developer that's not abiding by this long term. So, in fact, we're trying to get an engine. There's not a lot of owners and developers right now who want to do this and lock in this mission, and so that's why we're creating now with Envision Housing. There may hopefully be some others down the road who will do that New Way Homes can lend to as well. But you know, the ability to continue to get this kind of financing and be predicated on continuing to meet those guidelines and contractual requirements. And we have some other ideas on how to set up mechanisms as well. So I'll stop there. It's an area that's very interesting to me. Again, how do we ensure this impact, ensure there are not owners trying to maximize, that unless you have a default to the bank, you're not having someone, you know, at a whim say, oh, now I want it to be a mostly market rate building. So we have some very good structures. We're working with cutting edge capital, cutting edge counsel in Oakland as impact investment experts who also have a lot of expertise on loan agreements, nonprofit loan agreements, to set all those things up.
Great, lovely. And I imagine that brings me to the next point. That is also something that could be put in the terms of the investment from the individual investor, let's say, or the institutional investor into New Way Homes, right? That could be part of those terms. Yeah, and for investors specifically interested in that, we can look at that. We want to, and we will have that with some of the foundations investing, some of those kinds of things. Right now with our offering and our PPM, it says some of those things we're attempting to set up until we get those done and know for sure it's going to work with the banks, for example. You know, we hate to lock ourselves up too much, but as we prove this model, we'll have those documented, and that'll be easier and easier to have specified. Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit more about the actual terms of the offering, if it's possible? Yeah, so I mean, at a broad strokes, it's fairly simple. It's a 10-year note, and like I said, it makes annual interest payments that you know, are set using the federal applicable rate and through a certain process. So it's a little more complicated, but in general, like for example, right now, you know, we're anticipating around 2.5% minimum, and then that'll stick through the 10 years. So there's a minimum annual interest payment. It happens in the first quarter of every year, and then there is any income to the fund from its loans in the given year. Beyond that, 95% of that income gets distributed out to investors. So some years that will be higher than the minimum. And then the principal and an additional amount to bring up to 6% average annual return is due at year 10. So, and that's where we set up through the loan agreements, exactly, you know, backing that with the assets, but you know, those assets aren't in place today because they're being constructed. So that's why we went to some local impact investors last year to put the first money in and to seek that grant, because we recognize that well before the first project is entitled, there's extra risk. So we're over that hurdle. Right. Do you have any other specific questions on that? Just wondering if there's a minimum investment side on the accredited.
Yeah, we in our PPM, we state a $10,000 minimum. That's not even a hard and fast requirement, but in general, that's what we're doing with accredited investors, while we're then coming up with what is the best option to pursue the unaccredited investor, or you know, combining those offerings into one offering that can also have unaccredited investors and will have that level of a minimum.
Right. So very much along the lines of what we discussed recently, around the Force for Good fund, there is this intrinsic element of democratizing not just the output, right, of more affordable housing, but also the input of who gets to invest and who gets to play a role in shaping the type of housing that is available in the community.
Cool. And we have in our loan policies, in New Way Homes loan policies, all kinds of other secondary goals. So we have this, you know, top goal. In fact, we even state the top goal in New Way Homes loan policies as, you know, as much deed restricted affordable housing as we can get. But then beyond that, you know, affecting the overall rent in the market, I've talked about that, but also, you know, increasing density in the job-rich, transit-rich, service-rich areas, reducing environmental impact. You know, a number of sub-goals like that, if we're meeting our primary goals, then we also want to maximize those things. And when you look at that, you're changing and hopefully moving forward in positive ways the nature of a community, especially a downtown or a dense corridor. And so that's why I just feel so strongly. We have some projects in our pipeline now that really could move forward some underdeveloped, struggling downtowns. And so we want to bring that community in, not only have a voice in where's your downtown going, how can we help with our mission, how can we help get it there, but also say, and you can invest in the process. So
great. Yeah. And a couple more things here. Yeah, one, many of you might remember a while back, maybe over a year ago, we did a webinar with Rock USA and manufactured home communities. And Paul from Rock USA is mentioning and asking whether the private offering is for the equity in the deal, and mentioning their limited equity co-op model that they've used and that we have highlighted in the past as something that might be applicable to this as well. And then just to use the last few minutes, Sibley, I'll throw that out there as well. There was more interest in hearing about how you're thinking about that crowdfunding piece for unaccredited investors. And if you can give a little bit more of information on the or detail on the capitalization stack and the relationship between the New Way Homes financing with the other capital sources. I know it's a lot, but
yeah, that's a lot. And I'm not even remembering the question part of your the first one you threw out. Was there?
Well, the first one was yeah, just more commenting on the existence of this model that ROC developed around the limited equity co-op model. And we can put you in touch with Rock, of course, to discuss that. And
that would be great. I've heard about similar things elsewhere, and that's something I'm not an expert in that. I want to dive into it. It could be applicable to this down the road with one of those questions. So thank you for bringing that up. And yes, I'd love to do that. And then remind me the second question was the unaccredited investors. I got that.
Yeah, more information on that.
I mean, I'm not fully an expert either. I'm rapidly trying to get up to speed on the pros and cons of the different possibilities. So, you know, the Title III that allows you to do, you know, that's coming about with these platforms. The platforms aren't super experienced yet, so, you know, there are some bumps in the road there. But that allows you to do all 50 states, which isn't as relevant to us for unaccredited investors because it's so place-based. California is a large jurisdiction, and it's, you know, capped at $1 million. So it could be beneficial just to use the platform for the ease of use and, you know, visibility from folks nationally. So we're evaluating, okay, is it worth it doing that kind of Title III operating offering that can be separate and in addition and in parallel to other offerings. So that has some you know, interesting pros and cons. And then the other big vehicle for us would be doing a direct public offering in California. So just for California residents would allow, and that would have to combine with accredited and unaccredited investors in the same offering, most likely. And you know, then would have the advantage. This is a very capital intensive thing, so that could be one offering that would be much larger potentially than $1 million. And you know, that just takes a whole process with the state of California, often 6 months or so, to apply and go through regulatory approval to do that direct public offering. So those are, you know, the two primary vehicles, and just, you know, looking at timing and how does it affect our existing offering, you know, combined or in parallel, and do we, you know, at what time do we do either or both of those? So there's actually, you know, a long list of pros and cons of each of those and requirements you have to meet. So it goes into that whole evaluation. Right. And then thirdly, we're trying to keep the New Way Homes Fund from having, we want it to have as little effect as possible on the primary construction lending and on the permanent financing, because then we're open to more of the market for those types of financing, and therefore should have, you know, maximum choices, lowest cost. We have, that said, you know, it's different. It's not the normal thing of investors just putting in money, indefinitely having an ownership stake, and, you know, getting a share of profits, which we're frankly trying to limit. So, but when we've sat down with, you know, we haven't gone to the big national banks because, you know, they have their products, and we don't necessarily have people in this market you can sit down with and get outside those products. but with a local banks, you know, like in Santa Cruz County or Santa Cruz County Bank, Lighthouse Bank, great construction lenders that focus on that, we they're very willing to say, oh, I see what you're doing, I see your structure, I see that what you're doing with New Way Homes is totally second to our loan position. So some of the details, understand that's very interesting. We want to help have this community impact, but those details don't unduly affect the way we normally do loans, so we're willing to do our normal loan as a construction loan to you. And in many cases, they might consider permanent financing, but it's just more expensive from those players to do permanent financing. We want to be able to go out to the bigger market of you know, permanent financing, where it could be very large financial institutions and or Fannie Mae. And then some of the nonprofit lenders, we, you know, as I'm sure many people in this column know, you know, sometimes we'll do construction to permanent, or we'll do 40-year amortization instead of 30-year, or, you know, different things that can even further, I didn't list all those possibilities, but can even further improve our financial picture, allows us to accomplish more impact. So, or make more of the projects pencil out, you know, with sufficient impact. So, but we really are trying to say, okay, in a way that does not scare a whole set of possible lenders, construction and permanent financing, say, okay, how can we make this New Way Home, you know, effectively loan, sufficiently backed, with sufficient teeth on the impact, without scaring off those lenders. And with all the conversations we've had, we feel that that is very doable.
Great. I'm mindful that we're up at the 90 minutes, so if people need to jump off, by all means, feel free to do so. Sibley, do you want to take another couple of quick things, and maybe then we can just share the recording with folks if they want to get the answers on those?
Sounds good. Thank you.
If you don't mind, just a couple more minutes on that. So one couple of very interesting questions here. What do you think about paying the excess returns beyond that target and that cap that you would pay to the investors into residents' equity?
Yes. I feel like that's one of the answers. I mean, we have different choices. I mean, you know, if there's a required debt coverage ratio, and so you're kicking off some cash from the building, I think a couple good possibilities. One is apply that back into the model, use that to pay pre-development expenses on a next project so that higher risk actions there are taken outside of the New Way Homes funding, which is we are funding some of those activities, but primarily the fund wants to get involved with the acquisition development stage, not the early pre-development stage. It's higher risk. So, you know, there's some of that. We'd like some capital to be able to do that to fund new projects. But it's exactly right. That is, you know, there's the ability to, you know, if we use some kind of structure, co-op, partial co-op, REIT, you know, whatever, where we can issue shares and ownership in the housing to residents. But that only matters if it has some value to them. So the primary value, you know, that is, you know, if they just on paper own something, it might give them some pride of ownership, but how does that really help them if it's non-liquid asset? What really helps is if they get a share of some of that funding. And if you can do things, that's why I'm interested in combining that with some, you know, tenant influence in the management. What are great ways to do that that are not, don't unduly cause too much overhead, which, you know, would reduce that net income, but can efficiently do that and say, okay, if residents feel that this is a community and they're making some decisions about amenities, about, you know, various things, programs that can be done, and can make those trade-offs. Do we give everybody in the building a best pass? Do we, or, you know, or is it a little bit more income that's shared to the residents? Is it different things? So, you know, I'm speaking off the top of my head because I'm just extremely interested in those things. How can we have those without disrupting the whole model, but really make great communities that serve people's interests more than most disinterested owners of a buildings do? And for a lot of these folks, move them on a path to ownership, because nobody has ever proposed a plan that I've seen that has realistic possibility politically to get most people who are struggling with affording housing into deed restricted affordable housing or ownership of affordable housing. So that would be a great dream, but how can we get them to afford housing, helping them build towards that with their own personal resources, one tool.
Mm-hmm. Great. And one more thing, because we'll be considering this in one of the upcoming webinars, is this issue of community land trust and whether there is a way in which a CLT in Santa Cruz would intersect well with this type of development.
Yeah, I mean, as I think I've given just a quick overview, we want to bring every tool in the toolkit to bear on projects, and I have chosen to pursue primarily impact investing here because I think it can unlock at a scale that I would have a harder time pursuing with a even more philanthropic model. But if we can combine those things, I mean, that could be tremendous. So there could be, long-term ownership of these buildings as debt is paid way down. It could be in a community land trust or other, a nonprofit structure. It could be that community land trust helps acquire sites that then this model can combine with. Very interested in those things, and it's kind of one step that we've raised some philanthropic dollars to help make this model work, the grant New Way Homes got. We'd love to see more of those as it plays out. So we always have to be strategic and looking for more tools, but also tactical. And that's one whole subject I've said, okay, it's going to come a little bit further down the road after we prove this model. Then we need to look at those things.
Fantastic. Yeah, and just to come clean on my own dorkiness, I think it would be fabulous if you could document in a report or in a paper or otherwise all the thinking behind this and how you ended up on this model as compared with others, the success as it goes forward, and even, for us to continue workshopping some of the opportunities and some of the challenges that you're seeing with this, and that intersection with the idea in particular of the appropriate risk allocation. And the part that fascinates me on non-extractive returns, right, where you're being mindful that certain investors and certain lenders will have a specific rate of return that they need for this to happen, and how to weigh that against, leaving most of the value for the community that actually needs it the most.
And there's no question that when we get buildings actually built and occupied, spreading what has worked, what didn't work, the details of the model, I mean, I'm really excited to do that from New Home's point of view, because it's how we can achieve more impact. We can scale our efforts here in a responsible rate as we can accomplish them, but that's nowhere near enough either. We also need to have more people across the nation doing this or other models and variations thereon, to create more housing that is less expensive. So I can't wait till we're at the stage where we can not just say, oh, we've got all these ideas, look at our ideas, but we can say, here's what we did that worked.
Great. Yeah, and when you get to that stage, maybe you can invite us all to a party in Monterey County to celebrate all your work on this. Thank you so much. I think there are a lot of follow-up questions still from people. I would encourage folks to definitely get in touch with us, get in touch with Sibley. We can continue the conversation there, but I wanted to take a second to thank you all for participating, and thank you to Sibley for presenting to us today, and for all the fantastic work that you've been doing with this. And as a last thing, if any of the participants are not members and are interested in working with us on the Transform Finance Investor Network, feel free to reach out to me, Andrea Armeni, and my email is andrea@transformfinance.org. And thank you for your patience with going over time a little bit with us today. All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Sibley. Congratulations, and good luck with all your work.
Thank you very much.
Take care.